May 5, 1945. The war in Europe had 3 days left. Adolf Hitler was dead in a Berlin bunker. Across the continent, German units threw down their rifles in mass surrenders. But in the Tyrolean Alps of Austria, a medieval fortress sat on a jagged peak. Castle Itter. Inside these stone walls, the most bizarre event of the Second World War unfolded. What was happening at the gates? At first glance, a typical siege, but in reality, a desperate alliance. If a scout looked through binoculars, the sight made no sense. American GIs stood on the ramparts. They manned heavy machine guns, but standing directly next to them were soldiers in Wehrmacht uniforms. These Germans were not prisoners. They were armed. They were loading magazines and firing at their own countrymen. Who led this impossible force? An American tank commander named Captain Jack Lee Jr. stood at the center. He looked like a Hollywood lead. Beside him stood Major Josef Gangl. Gangl was a decorated German officer who simply wanted the killing to stop. The enemy moved through the trees below. It was the Waffen-SS. These were not regular conscripts. They were fanatical loyalists from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. Their objective was simple: storm the hill and execute everyone inside. The defenders were outnumbered. They had 1 Sherman tank. They had limited ammunition and a few crates of grenades. Their task was to protect high-profile French prisoners. The list included former prime ministers and top-ranking generals. Events accelerated. The SS began their ascent. This was not a fictional script. These events are recorded in military archives. It remains the only time in the entire conflict that the United States Army and the German Wehrmacht fought as allies. The footage would show smoke rising from the valley while 2 enemy armies shared the same foxhole. This is the story of the battle for Castle Itter. It is the account of the day enemies became brothers in arms. A single Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, stood between the prisoners and an SS firing squad. There was no turning back. To understand this anomaly, the focus must shift to the men trapped inside the stone walls. Itter Castle was not a typical prison. It was a luxury cage. The Nazis transformed this medieval fortress into a detention center for honor prisoners. These were high-profile French VIPs. Inside the stone walls were the men who once controlled France: Édouard Daladier, the former prime minister; Paul Reynaud, another prime minister; General Maxime Weygand, the former commander-in-chief of the French army. Even Jean Borotre, an international tennis star, was held there. These men shared a common hatred for the Germans, but in reality, they hated each other just as much. They spent years trapped in the same rooms, shouting about old political rivalries. Outside, SS guards paced the perimeter with submachine guns. By May 4, 1945, the atmosphere changed. The guards were getting nervous. Sebastian Wimmer, the SS commander of the castle, watched the horizon. He knew the German front was collapsing. He knew the Americans would arrest him for his rank. But he also had a direct order from Heinrich Himmler. The order was simple: no prisoner leaves alive. At first glance, Wimmer was a loyal executioner, but in reality, he was a coward. He looked at the American lines closing in. He looked at the fanatical SS units roaming the surrounding forests. Then, he made a choice. He didn't execute the prisoners. He gathered his personal belongings, abandoned his post, and vanished into the trees. The remaining SS guards followed him. The French VIPs were suddenly free, but they were trapped. The castle sat on a hill surrounded by dense woods. These forests were crawling with the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. These were die-hard Nazis. They were currently executing any German soldier who tried to surrender. To the SS, the French prisoners were walking targets. If the politicians tried to walk out the front gate, the SS would massacre them in the open. The prisoners didn't wait to die. They raided the armory, picking up rifles and pistols left behind by their captors. But there was a problem. They were old men. They were politicians and athletes, not a combat unit. They needed professional help. They found it in the most unlikely place. A few miles away, In the town of Wuergel, a different kind of German waited. May 4th, 1945. Major Josef Gangl stood in the town of Wuergel with a collapsing front line at his back. He was a decorated Wehrmacht officer and a veteran of the Eastern Front, but Gangl was no fanatic. He secretly collaborated with the Austrian resistance. He watched as SS units prepared explosives to destroy local bridges. Their plan was simple: scorched earth. Gangl had a different objective. He wanted to keep his soldiers alive and prevent the destruction of the town. He needed an exit strategy. He needed to surrender. Why did he risk everything? The answer arrived on a bicycle. Andreas Krobot, a Czech cook, rode through SS checkpoints to reach the major. He carried a message from Itter Castle. The information was grim. High-ranking French prisoners were trapped inside the fortress. The SS was mobilizing to execute them all. Gangl looked at his unit. He had too few men to hold off a professional execution squad, but he refused to allow a massacre. It was a matter of German military honor. He made a decision that defied every rule of war. Gangl grabbed a white flag and climbed into his Kubelwagen. He drove directly toward the advancing American lines. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for an ally. The camera would show a dusty German jeep speeding through no man's land. 8 miles away, the U.S. 12th Armored Division entered the town of Kufstein. Captain John Jack Lee led the reconnaissance unit. He was the image of a Hollywood tank commander. He was loud, aggressive, and constantly chomped on a cigar. His men followed him without question. Lee sat near his Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, when the German vehicle appeared. The American soldiers raised their weapons. Lee reached for his pistol. The German jeep stopped. Major Gangl stepped out and saluted. He didn't reach for a Luger. In broken English, he explained the crisis. French 5IPs were hours away from death. The SS was closing in. Gangl offered his men, his weapons, and his knowledge of the terrain to the Americans. At first glance, it looked like an ambush, but in reality it was a desperate gamble. Captain Lee stared at the German officer. He processed the risks of a joint operation with the enemy. He chewed his cigar and looked at the tactical map. He made his choice. "All right, Fritz," Lee said. "Let's go get them." Events accelerated. Lee and Gangl began planning the most improbable mission of the war. They weren't just two officers from opposing sides. They were now a single unit. There was no turning back. The rescue of Castle Itter had begun. Captain Lee reached for his radio. He contacted his headquarters with a brief message. He was launching a rescue mission to Castle Itter. He told his superiors he was taking a German major as his partner. The commanders at HQ believed Lee was losing his mind. Despite the risk, they gave him the green light. Lee began assembling his strike force immediately. The squad was small. It consisted of 2 tanks and 7 American infantrymen. Major Gangl provided a truckload of Wehrmacht soldiers. This was the strangest convoy of the Second World War. An American tank took the lead. A German truck followed directly behind. Together, they drove toward territory controlled by the SS. The vehicles climbed the narrow, winding road toward the fortress. They soon encountered SS roadblocks. The tank, named Besotten Jenny, fired its main gun. It blasted the obstacles into scrap metal. German soldiers in the truck leaned out and fired their Mauser rifles at the SS guards. They cleared the path and reached the castle gate. The French 5IPs stepped out into the courtyard. They expected to see a massive American division. Instead, they saw 1 tank and 7 Americans. Behind them stood a group of Germans in Wehrmacht uniforms. The French prisoners were visibly confused. They asked where the rest of the army was located. Captain Lee climbed out of the hatch. He didn't offer a formal greeting. He simply grinned. This was the entire rescue force. Lee took command of the situation instantly. He was only a captain, but he treated the French prime ministers like low-ranking privates. He gave them direct orders. He told them to get inside and stay away from the windows. Lee began his defense plan. He parked the Besotten Jenny directly in front of the main gate. He ordered his gunner to keep the main cannon aimed at the road. He moved the German soldiers onto the castle walls. He placed his American infantrymen inside the stone towers. The captain turned to Major Gangl. He told the major to watch the south wall while he watched the gate. Gangl snapped a salute. A rare scene followed. For the first time in 5 years, German and American soldiers sat together. They shared cigarettes, they traded food. They checked the ammunition in each other's weapons. The battle was coming. May 5th, 1945. Dawn. They knew they would die together once the sun rose. The morning fog lifted from the valley. Then came the first shot. 150 men from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division emerged from the woods. They brought anti-tank guns, mortars, and heavy machine guns. They were not just soldiers, they were executioners. The SS commanders saw the American tank guarding the gate. They saw their own countrymen, Gangl's men, firing from the battlements. To the SS, Gangl was not a soldier. He was a traitor. They focused their entire arsenal on the castle. High-caliber bullets chipped away at the medieval stone walls. Dust and debris filled the air. The French 5 YPs did not hide in the cellar. Paul Renault and Edouard Daladier grabbed infantry rifles. They took positions at the windows and returned fire. Even the tennis star, Jean Borotra, joined the line. But the defenders were outgunned. The SS deployed an 88mm anti-tank gun. The crew aimed at the gate, specifically at the tank nicknamed Besotten Jenny. The 88mm shell hit the hull. The Besotten Jenny burst into a ball of fire. The American crew scrambled out of the hatch seconds before the magazine exploded. Their only heavy weapon was now a burning wreck. The situation changed instantly. It was now bolt-action rifles against a mechanized army. Captain Lee moved between positions. He showed no fear. He calmly cut the fuse on his last cigar and lit it. He looked at his men. He told them not to worry. He said the SS had to come through the gate and they would pile the bodies up like cordwood. The battle raged for 4 hours. The defenders were down to their last crates of ammunition. The SS were now in the lower courtyard. At first glance, a hopeless siege. But in reality, a desperate gamble for time. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. Thus, the final stand began. "400 SS soldiers moved closer. They prepared to storm the castle walls. Major Gangl stood on the rampart. He directed the return fire. Below him, he saw Prime Minister Paul Renault standing in the open. Renault was completely exposed to the sniper fire. Gangl did not hesitate. He ran toward the politician. "Get down!" he shouted. He pushed Renault to the floor. A sniper bullet struck Major Gangl in the chest. He collapsed instantly. The German officer died while saving a French politician. He fell while fighting alongside Americans against the fanatics of his own country. He was the only defender killed during the entire battle. The hero of the day wore a Wehrmacht uniform. How did the battle reach this point? At first glance, a hopeless siege, but in reality, a desperate gamble for survival. The defenders counted their remaining rounds. The tank sat in the courtyard, a smoking wreck. It was no longer a shield. The SS gathered for the final assault. There was no mistake. The end was minutes away. Events accelerated. 12 o'clock. Captain Lee checked his magazine. It was nearly empty. He looked at his men. They were almost dry. He knew the perimeter would collapse within the hour. He needed to reach the American main force. The tank radio was silent. The wires were melted. Jean Borotra, the international tennis champion, stepped forward. He did not look like a soldier. "I will go," Borotra said. "I am fast, I can run." The plan was suicidal. Borotra did not wait for an argument. He vaulted over the castle wall. The camera would show a lone man sprinting across an open field. The SS opened fire. Bullets kicked up clouds of dust around his boots. He did not stop. He dodged and weaved through the incoming rounds. He disappeared into the dense woods. He ran for several miles. He did not slow down until he saw steel on the road. It was an American relief column. Borotra reached the lead tank. He was gasping for air. He could not speak. The sound of heavy engines filled the valley. The relief had arrived. Thus began the final minutes of the siege. "The castle," he gasped. "They are dying. You must hurry." At that moment, the SS launched their final assault on Castle Itter. They reached the main gate. They set the charges. A massive explosion blew the entrance wide open. Captain Lee heard the blast. He didn't hesitate. He ordered his men to fix bayonets. The plan was simple. Hand-to-hand combat in the courtyard. Total defiance. The German defenders checked their weapons. They pulled the triggers. Only clicks. The magazines were empty. Then, a new sound echoed through the valley. It wasn't the crack of rifles. It was the roar of heavy engines. Around the bend of the mountain road, the 142nd Infantry Regiment appeared. Sherman tanks led the way. Hundreds of American soldiers followed. They opened fire on the SS positions. The SS troops realized the situation. They were trapped between the castle walls and American steel. They broke ranks. They fled into the thick woods. The siege was over. The relief force stormed the courtyard. They found Captain Lee standing among the debris. His face was stained black with soot and gunpowder. He looked at the relief commander. He pulled a cigar from his teeth. "What took you so long?" The battle was won. The French prisoners were loaded into vehicles and driven to safety. Within days, the German High Command surrendered. The war was officially over. Captain Jack Lee returned to New York. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a book. He opened a hotel and lived a quiet life. He never bragged about the day he held the castle. Major Josef Gangl did not go home. He was buried in the town of Wörgl. Today, he is a national hero in Austria. A street bears his name. He remains the German officer who gave his life to stop the Nazis. The battle for Castle Itter was a small skirmish. In the context of World War II, it was a footnote. But it was a signal. Even in the middle of total war, the rules changed. Enemies became allies. Men chose a side based on conscience rather than a uniform. Years later, people asked Lee about that day. He would only smile. "It was the weirdest thing I ever saw," he said. "Me and the Krauts fighting side by side." It remains the only documented battle where the United States Army and the German Wehrmacht fought as one unit. A strange conclusion to a global catastrophe. Major Gangl died protecting a French politician. Some called him a traitor. History calls him a hero. The story of the alliance at the castle remains a unique anomaly in the history of warfare. Thus ended the strangest battle of 1945.